In this episode, we're going to take the idea of monitoring and make it feel less like wishful thinking and more like deliberate design. Most beginners assume that if you buy the right monitoring technology and turn it on, visibility will simply appear, but visibility is really about where you can observe, what you can reliably interpret, and what gaps you are willing to accept. A sensor, in the security sense, is anything that collects signals about activity so defenders can detect problems and investigate them later. And sensors only help when they are positioned where meaningful signals actually pass. The tricky part is that modern networks are full of encryption, distributed services, and shifting traffic patterns, which means some of the most important activity is hard to see from the places people traditionally monitored. We're going to focus on how to place sensors intentionally, how encryption changes what sensors can learn, and how to make practical trade-offs without fooling yourself about coverage. A good way to start thinking about sensor placement is to treat the network as a system of paths and decision points rather than a collection of devices. Sensors are most valuable at points where many important paths converge, because those points let you observe a broad range of behavior with a single, well-chosen collection strategy. These convergence points are often boundaries between zones, gateways to external networks, and internal corridors that critical services must traverse. When you place sensors randomly, you tend to either collect too much low-value noise or miss the important flows entirely, which leads to a frustrating situation where you have lots of data but little clarity. Purposeful placement begins with a simple question. If an attacker enters here, or if a compromised device tries to spread, where must it go next to achieve something valuable? The answer identifies seams where you can observe movement and policy decisions, which makes the collected signals more meaningful for detection and investigation. A beginner-friendly mental model is to think in terms of three observation layers that complement each other: boundary observation, internal seam observation, and asset proximate observation. Boundary observation focuses on where your environment interacts with outside networks, because those interactions often include scanning, initial exploitation attempts, and outbound command and control. Internal seam observation focuses on the points where traffic crosses between zones, because that's where lateral movement should become visible if your segmentation is doing its job. Asset proximate observation focuses on the systems that matter most, such as identity services, management networks, and data repositories, because even subtle suspicious activity near those assets can be high impact. A mature sensor strategy aims to create overlap between these layers so that if one layer is blind for a specific event, another layer still produces evidence. That overlap is what turns monitoring from a fragile set of assumptions into a resilient capability. When people place sensors poorly, it's often because they confuse network reachability with monitoring value. Just because a sensor can be plugged into a network segment does not mean it will see useful traffic, especially in switched environments where traffic is not broadcast everywhere. In many modern networks, a sensor might only see a tiny fraction of flows unless it is placed at a choke point or configured to receive the right mirrored traffic. Even when traffic is visible, it may not be interpretable if it is heavily encrypted or if the sensor lacks context about which devices and users are involved. This is why purposeful placement includes mapping the main traffic flows and understanding which devices actually carry those flows. You want your sensors to sit where reality passes, not where diagrams suggest it might pass. The more your architecture uses controlled pathways, the easier it becomes to place sensors effectively, because the network itself concentrates what matters. Now we need to talk about encryption, because encryption is one of the biggest reasons sensor placement has changed over time. Transport layer security, TLS, is widely used to protect data in transit, which is a good thing for privacy and integrity, but it reduces what network-based sensors can see inside the communication. When traffic is encrypted, a network sensor can still observe metadata such as source, destination, timing, and volume, but it may not be able to inspect the payload for known malicious patterns. This changes the detection balance, because many older detection approaches relied on seeing the content of sessions. If you assume you can still read everything, you will design a monitoring strategy that looks complete on paper but fails in practice. Purposeful sensor placement treats encryption as a fact of life and then asks which signals remain dependable and where additional context can be collected, such as at endpoints or at controlled gateways where inspection is permissible and safe. A practical trade-off emerges here, and it's worth understanding it clearly. You can either accept less visibility into content, or you can create controlled points where decryption and inspection occur under strict policy. Some organizations choose to inspect certain categories of traffic at a secure gateway, while others avoid decryption because of privacy, legal, or operational concerns. Regardless of the choice, the key is honesty about what you can and cannot see. If you cannot inspect content, your sensors must lean more heavily on behavior, metadata, and endpoint evidence. That means you care more about unusual destinations, unexpected data volumes, strange connection timing, and abnormal process behavior on devices. If you do inspect content at certain gateways, you must treat those gateways as highly sensitive assets because they become powerful observation points and attractive targets. Either way, encryption forces you to design monitoring intentionally rather than relying on passive network taps to reveal everything. Because encrypted traffic limits payload inspection, identity and endpoint sensors often become the anchor that gives network observations meaning. A network sensor might tell you that a workstation connected to an unfamiliar external address, but an endpoint sensor can tell you which process initiated the connection and whether that process is expected. Similarly, identity logs can tell you whether the user associated with that workstation recently authenticated from an unusual location or used elevated privileges unexpectedly. When you place sensors with purpose, you intentionally connect these perspectives, so the network view becomes the map and the endpoint and identity views become the details that explain what the map is showing. This layered approach also reduces false positives because it allows you to filter suspicious network patterns through the reality of device behavior and user context. It is much easier to act confidently when multiple sensors agree, and it is much safer to hesitate when only one weak signal suggests trouble. Another important placement consideration is the difference between observing traffic that is initiating a connection and observing traffic that is responding. Many attacks rely on an internal device initiating outbound connections for command and control, data exfiltration, or downloading additional tools. So sensors that observe outbound gateways can catch patterns that would never appear as inbound threats. At the same time, lateral movement often appears as internal initiation of connections towards servers that should not be broadly reachable, which means internal seam sensors are essential if segmentation is meant to be a real barrier. Purposeful placement therefore emphasizes initiation points because initiation often reveals intent. This is also where well-designed firewall logging and flow data can become powerful because you can see what attempted to happen, what was allowed, and what was denied. A sensor strategy that ignores initiation tends to miss early attacker behavior and only sees the aftermath near critical assets. Visibility is also shaped by how services are delivered, and modern environments often route traffic in ways that bypass traditional monitoring points. Cloud services, software-as-a-service platforms, and remote work patterns can cause traffic to move directly from endpoints to external providers without traversing centralized internal gateways. If you assume all traffic passes through a central data center boundary, you may place sensors there and then discover that much of the real activity never touches that path. Purposeful placement responds by identifying the actual egress points and the actual authentication points, which might include remote access gateways, cloud identity services, and managed endpoints rather than a single corporate perimeter. This is where monitoring can become more distributed, and the design challenge is to keep signals consistent and centrally correlated. The key is not insisting on an old perimeter model, but ensuring you still have strong observation where decisions and transitions occur. Practical trade-offs also show up in how you handle volume and noise, because a sensor that collects everything can become more harmful than helpful. High-volume collection without clear purpose can overwhelm storage, slow investigations, and increase alert fatigue, which indirectly reduces security. Purposeful placement, therefore, includes being selective about what you collect at each point and how you summarize it. For example, flow records might be sufficient at certain high-throughput links, while more detailed logs are reserved for narrower choke points or high-risk segments. The goal is to capture enough evidence to reconstruct what happened without drowning your team in unstructured data. This is not about cutting corners. It is about aligning collection depth with risk and feasibility. When you do it well, your monitoring becomes sustainable, And sustainability matters because detection is a long-term discipline, not a one-time project. Sensor placement also has to account for attacker behavior, including the fact that attackers intentionally seek blind spots and may try to disable or evade monitoring. If sensors are only placed at the edge, attackers who gain an internal foothold can operate laterally with less risk of detection. If sensors are only placed inside, you may miss the early signs of external probing and outbound command and control. Purposeful placement creates a mix of perspectives so that an attacker has to work harder to avoid all observations simultaneously. It also means protecting the monitoring infrastructure itself, because logs that remain only on the compromised system are easy to erase. Central log collection, access controls, and integrity protections make sensor data more trustworthy, which is critical during incident response. A sensor that produces untrustworthy evidence is a liability, because it can mislead defenders at exactly the moment clarity is most needed. Another subtle but important part of purposeful placement is ensuring your sensors can distinguish normal variability from meaningful change. This is where baselines and asset context become practical tools rather than abstract ideas. A sudden increase in outbound connections might be harmless on a patch management server during an update window, but it might be suspicious on a finance workstation late at night. A burst of authentication failures might be normal during a password reset campaign, but dangerous when it targets privileged accounts across many systems. Purposeful placement goes hand in hand with purposeful tagging and asset classification, because the same sensor data can mean very different things depending on what system produced it and what role that system plays. When you design for this context, you make alerts more accurate and investigations faster, because you can interpret signals in the right frame. Over time, purposeful sensor placement becomes a living practice because networks evolve, applications move, and encryption patterns change. A sensor that was perfectly placed a year ago might become less valuable if traffic shifts to a new pathway, and a new business initiative might create a new critical seam that needs observation. This is why mature monitoring programs treat sensor placement as something to revisit periodically rather than a decision made once. They look for evidence that coverage is drifting, such as incidents that were discovered by accident rather than by monitoring, or repeated investigations where key logs were missing. They also validate that sensors are still producing the signals they were expected to produce, and that those signals are still being collected centrally and consistently. This ongoing validation is not busy work. It is what keeps visibility real instead of imaginary. Without it, you can end up confident and blind at the same time. As we wrap up, the main idea is that sensors only work when they are placed with purpose, aligned to real traffic paths, and honest about the limits imposed by encryption. Boundary sensors give you visibility into external interactions and outbound behavior. Internal seam sensors reveal lateral movement attempts across trust boundaries, and asset proximate sensors provide high-fidelity evidence near the systems that matter most. Transport layer security, TLS, reduces payload visibility for network sensors, which means modern strategies rely more on metadata patterns and stronger endpoint and identity signals to explain what network flows represent. Practical trade-offs are unavoidable, including trade-offs about inspection, privacy, performance, and alert volume. But those trade-offs can be managed well when you design for sustainability and overlapping coverage. When you learn to ask where the meaningful signals actually pass, and how those signals will remain trustworthy during an incident, you stop treating monitoring as a hopeful afterthought. You start treating it as an architectural capability that can genuinely support detection, investigation, and recovery.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.